first book of the Mahabharata, but given a quite quirky version. And of course the Ramayana is something that is also realised and goes from India to ancient Java to Bali as part of that long continuous tradition. And I'll finish with that slide, which is also a plug for the National Gallery of Australia's current exhibition, Island of the Gods, which is on Bali. So if you're going to Canberra in the next month or so, you can see that, which includes this wonderful early 19th century Balinese illustrated manuscript of the Ramayana. So that's really to give you a sense of the continuity of Majapahit, and that it's left a long-standing legacy both in terms of the spread of its influence throughout Southeast Asia, right into mainland Southeast Asia, and left very strong traditions of practice in Bali itself. And so I think when you go to East Java, when you go to Bali, you can think of this as continuations of the Majapahit tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk, Adrian. I think we have some time for questions. If you would like to field a few questions, that'd be great. I'll throw the floor open, and I see the fastest hand in the room is right here.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating. I wanted to ask, in mainland Southeast Asia, the Hindu-Buddhist religion ultimately became a version where Buddhism was dominant. And then in Java, Bali, at least Bali became predominantly Hindu. Now, would it be fair to infer from that Java, if it hadn't become Muslim, was also headed in that predominantly Hindu direction? And if so, could you maybe speculate a bit? Why is it that in Java, Bali, the Hindu-Buddhist religion moved in a Hindu direction, whereas on mainland Southeast Asia, it moved in a Buddhist direction? A second question relates to the size of the monuments. So you talked about why we had we had these small monuments in East Java, but very large Borobudur and Prambanan in Central Java. And I think you mentioned a bit that maybe in East Java, to consolidate their power, it's better to build small monuments here and there. But then that kind of raises the question, why did it make more sense to build such large monuments in Central Java earlier on? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Wow, they're both big questions, and I think each deserves a lecture in itself. Going to the first one, again, we don't actually know enough about the kingdoms that existed in Central Java. And again, it would be really nice from my colleagues at the Sydney University project on Angkor to use some of their technological gains or technological methodology to try to extend our picture of Central Java. I think if you look at the picture that's emerging of Angkor as a dispersed urban area, as Roland Fletcher calls it, then we might think of Central Java as probably the same, that Prambanan and Borobudur are part of the same single space in that Kedu Basin area. And to some degree, that's more constrained by geography. So there's one single basin where there's only one major volcano. There are others around, but Mount Merapi there. And I guess it's less flexible, less subject to change. So you don't have the same number of volcanoes, the same instability, but you're also not trying to work over as large a dispersed landscape. So that's my theory about why we get more monumental buildings in Central Java, although of course that doesn't last, and so that also tells us that the Javanese model is perhaps not as sustainable as the Angkorian model. In terms of how things pan out later, again, there's a big shift as I said, the beginning of the 10th century from Central Java to East Java. Around the 14th, 15th century, but really going into the 16th century, you get the whole of Southeast Asia making a big shift in religious terms, and Tony Reid and others have tried to put that picture together. It seems from the evidence that, in fact, there was some kind of ecological change. There was a major fluctuation in the monsoons around that period, and that this seems to have really spelt the end of the classical Hindu-Buddhist polities that were these large trading states, and that they were replaced by new religions. So although mainland Southeast Asia is Buddhist, it became Theravada Buddhist, and that displaced the Mahayana Buddhism, which was, I guess, much more intermeshed with Hinduism in both central and both mainland and island Southeast Asia. So likewise, the big shift that happens in island Southeast Asia is the coming of Islam, which is again a much more dispersed, less monumental, more flexible, trade-connected kind of religion that creates new political systems along with the new religious system. And I think there's more historical work to be done to map out the consequences and meaning of that change. But it was quite gradual. So the understanding, when you look at the evidence from the 16th, 17th century, is that there was very much a gradual appropriation of the Hindu elements into what became Javanese version of Islam. So if you go to the saints' graves in North Java, what you'll find is actually a whole lot of them seem to be Hindu temples that have been turned into Muslim sites. And there are lots, in fact, Madi Wijaya, who's done work on this, has a whole lot of legends about particular bits and pieces that you'll find in some of these saints' graves, which seem to have actually come from the palace of Majapahit and have been ended up enshrined in a Muslim saints' grave. So our picture of Hinduism and Islam being at war is certainly not true for 16th, 17th century Java. And so I think the ways that there was a gradual displacement meant that that you get a very different picture of the kinds of religious practices that were spread throughout. Certainly Bali remained Hindu and did not convert to Buddhism, but to Islam. But there were also other parts of Java that didn't convert. So the Tengger people in Bromo retained their Hindu tradition. In fact, some of the same scriptures that the Tengger use are texts that are used in Bali. So we see a gradual displacement and people choosing to change their religion, but in some cases, as in Bali and Tengger, they choose not to change their religion. So that's as much as we know, really.
All right, well, it seems we've been fully edified at this point, and it is a little on the late side, so I suppose it's about time to wrap up. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great turnout, and very impressed to see that. And do we have any other announcements or things that we need to put out before we close, or are we done? Okay, great.
Thank you from the Ceramic Society, a copy of our last publication. And let me pull it out. There we go.